In medieval Europe, a lord could legally walk into your home on your wedding night, take your bride to his bed, and there was not a single thing you could do about it. No court to appeal to, no authority above him, because on his land, he was the authority. They called it the right of the first night, and kings, historians, and filmmakers have been fighting over whether it was real for the last 500 years. But the truth behind this practice is more disturbing than any version Hollywood ever gave you. Because whether the law existed or not, the horror behind it absolutely did. The cage you were born in 205025. To understand how something this twisted could even be possible, you need to understand what it actually meant to be a serf in the Middle Ages. Because this was not about one disgusting law. This was about an entire system designed to make sure you owned nothing. Not your land, not your labor, not even your own family. If you were born a serf in medieval Europe, you belonged to whatever lord controlled the land you lived on. You could not leave your village without his permission. You could not sell your crops without his approval. You could not change jobs, move towns, or start a new life somewhere else. Every option a free person takes for granted was locked behind a gate, and your lord held the only key. But it got worse than that. The description from an English estate in 1298 spells out exactly what a serf owed. You would plow and harrow a quarter acre at your own expense. Every second day of the entire year, you worked for the lord. Carrying, mowing, reaping, carting, doing whatever his bailiff told you to do. Your only days off were Saturdays and major church holidays. Everything else belonged to him, and that was just your labor. You also owed a portion of every harvest. You paid fines when a family member died. If your daughter had a child outside of marriage, you paid a penalty called lea white. You could not hunt on the lord's land, fish in his rivers, or bake bread without using his ovens. And you paid a fee for each one of those things. Now, if you think that sounds suffocating, wait, because the part that connects directly to the wedding night horror was a specific fee, called the mercet, was a payment every serf owed his lord whenever a daughter got married. Sounds like a simple tax, right? Think about what that actually means for a second. Your lord had the legal power to approve or deny your marriage. If you could not pay, the wedding did not happen. Full stop. Your love, your plans, your future family, all of it depended on whether some nobleman felt like saying yes. And if a serf died without children, all of his property went straight back to the lord. Not to his brother, not to his parents. The lord took everything. In some manors, even when heirs existed, the lord could seize the best animal the family owned as an inheritance tax. Your father dies, and the lord walks away with the only cow keeping your family alive. So, understand the world we're dealing with here. A lord already controlled whether you could get married at all. He controlled where you lived, what you ate, and how you spent every waking hour. Every breath you took had a price tag on it, and he was the one collecting. Now, ask yourself this. In a world where one man held that much power over another, what exactly was stopping him from taking your bride, too? That question is the entire reason this story exists, where this nightmare started. 5 to 9:30. The first written reference to anything resembling the right of the first night goes back nearly 4,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature ever created, describes the king of Uruk holding a very specific privilege over his subjects. Gilgamesh took the bride before the husband. Went first. The groom came after. Now that text is a literary work, not a legal document. Whether it reflects actual Sumerian practice or poetic exaggeration is still debated. But the fact that this concept appears in one of the earliest stories humans ever wrote tells you something uncomfortable. The idea that powerful men could claim access to women on their wedding night is older than most civilizations on this planet, and it kept showing up again and again. The Babylonian Talmud describes a Syrian Greek ruler who imposed a decree on the Jewish community demanding that all brides be brought before him prior to their weddings. In the Etruscan city of Volsini, around 280 BC, the lower classes revolted against the aristocrats specifically because of this kind of abuse. When the common people finally rose up, they turned the practice back on the nobles as revenge. They took the aristocrats' daughters and placed them under the same arrangement their own women had suffered through. That revolt happened over 2,000 years ago, and people were already so enraged by this practice that they burned their society to the ground over it. But all of those examples come from the ancient world. The real controversy starts in medieval Europe. And this is where the story stops being straightforward and starts getting genuinely strange. In 1527, the Scottish historian Hector Bowes claimed that the right of the first night had existed in Scotland for centuries. According to his account, King Malcolm III abolished it in the late 1000s, influenced by his wife Margaret, who later became a saint. The merchant payment was instituted as a replacement. You paid the lord money, and he gave up his claim to your bride. Bowes even named the king who originally created the law, a ruler called Evanus III. One problem: Evanus III never existed. Bowes invented him. You would think that would have killed the story right there, but it did the opposite. Other Scottish scholars quoted Bowes with full approval for decades. Legal scholars referenced the first night privilege in formal legal texts well into the 1600s. The English jurist William Blackstone mentioned it in his commentaries on the laws of England in the 1760s, though he noted the custom had never reached England. And then, in 1762, the French philosopher Voltaire weaponized the concept. He coined the term droit du Seigneur, the Lord's right. Voltaire did not care whether it was historically accurate. He was waging war against the aristocracy, and this was the perfect ammunition. Too powerful a weapon to fact-check. From that point on, the story embedded itself permanently into European culture. Bear built an entire play around it in 1784, The Marriage of Figaro. Mozart turned that play into one of the most famous operas ever performed. And in 1995, Mel Gibson put the concept on screen, showing King Edward I encouraging his nobles to take Scottish brides on their wedding nights. That one scene horrified millions of people. Most of them walked out of the theater believing every word of it. But Edward I never issued that order. It never happened. Gibson needed a villain, and a 4,000-year-old myth gave him one. So, was any of it real? After all of that build-up, you would expect historians to have found a mountain of evidence proving this practice actually happened across medieval Europe. They did not, and that is what makes this story so much stranger than fiction. The German scholar Karl Schmidt published a thorough analysis in 1881 and concluded the whole thing was nothing more than a learned superstition. The French writer Louis Viau put it even more bluntly. Nothing in the legal archives of any European country authorized this practice. Not one document. Alain Bouvel, a modern French historian, spent years digging into every available source across multiple countries. Same conclusion. No medieval legal document anywhere in Europe confirms the existence of a formalized rite of the first night. So, the case is closed, right? The whole thing was made up. Not so fast, because there is one document that gets dangerously close to proving something real was going on. In 1486, King Ferdinand II of Aragon issued a legal decree called the Sententia Arbitral de Guerre. Article 9 of that decree explicitly forbade lords from sleeping with the new brides of their peasants. Stop and think about that for a second. A king felt the need to officially ban this behavior. You do not pass a law against something nobody is doing. You do not carve an order into legal stone unless somebody somewhere has been doing exactly what you are telling them to stop. Historians will point out that Article 9 listed a whole series of abuses, and none of them derived from any recognized legal right. Ferdinand was not abolishing a law. He was cracking down on behavior that lords had been getting away with because nobody could hold them accountable. And this distinction matters enormously because there's a massive difference between a codified legal right and a powerful man doing whatever he wants because no one can stop him. Imagine you are a peasant farmer in 1400 Spain. You just watched your neighbor's daughter get dragged from the church on her wedding day by the local lordsmen. Everyone in the village saw it. Nobody moved. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word, because every person in that crowd knew that opening their mouth meant losing their land, their home, and everything they had. That is not a law. That is terror. And it works just as well. The biography of Gerald of Aurillac, written by Odo of Cluny in the 900s, describes a young nobleman who demanded to sleep with one of his serfs. According to the story, Only a miracle prevented the act from happening. Not a law, not a court, not a protest. A miracle. That was what it took to stop him. Gerald later went on to become a saint. The American historian Vern Bulow studied this account and argued that the fact that it took divine intervention to prevent the assault tells us this behavior was probably common. The legend, Bulow wrote, reflected reality. Then there is the case that might be the most disturbing of all. Francesco Campitelli held the title of Count of Malissa in southern Italy. In 1624, he issued an ordinance attempting to reinstate the first night privilege over the peasants in his territory. According to local accounts, his men abducted brides from the church immediately after their wedding ceremonies. The outrage this caused became legendary in the region for centuries. Was Campitelli exercising a recognized legal right? Absolutely not. He was a tyrant, exploiting his position because he knew nobody beneath him had the power to refuse. And the 14th century French epic poem, Baudin de Sabach, describes a lord who claims the first night, unless he receives part of the bride's. Do it, pay me or I take your wife. That is not a law. That is extortion dressed up in authority. And it was written in an era when audiences clearly understood this as something that could happen to real people. The truth. Nobody wants to hear 1432, 1900. So the formal, codified right of the first night as a recognized law across medieval Europe probably never existed. Most historians agree on that. But what did exist was something that for the people living through it made the distinction almost meaningless. The feudal system gave lords such total, absolute control over their serfs that the legal technicality of whether a specific bedroom privilege was written into law barely mattered. Think about your own life for a second. If someone controlled your job, your home, your food, your ability to marry, and your right to leave, would you really need them to wave a piece of paper in your face before you felt owner? That is what serf was. Ownership without the word. If your lord could deny your marriage entirely, force you to pay for the privilege of marrying your own wife, take your crops, seize your labor, and punish you for leaving his land. What reality barrier stood between him and your bride on her wedding night? In most cases, the answer was nothing. Nothing except his own conscience, the disapproval of the church, or the fear that his serfs might eventually revolt. Conscience is weak. The church was far away, and revolts take generations to build in history. Shows us that all three of those restraints failed on a regular basis. So what actually happened behind closed doors? We do not have confessions. We do not have trial records, but we have something almost worse. We have the money trail. The Scottish legal scholar David Maxwell Walker reviewed centuries of records and concluded that the practice likely existed as an informal custom in Scotland dependent on the attitude of the reigning king and survived. Longest in remote regions where no one was watching. Samuel Johnson and James Boswell, during their famous tour of Scotland in 1773, documented the merchant payment and drew a direct line between it and the right of the first night. In their understanding, the money was a buyout. You paid to keep the lord away from your wife. And that might be the darkest version of this entire story. Not a formal law, not a grand proclamation, just a quiet arrangement between a powerful man and a powerless one. You hand over your coins, and the lord agrees not to touch your bride. And if you could not pay, nobody wrote down what happened next. Nobody et tu. The silence in the historical record speaks louder than any confession ever could. The Acts of the Saints, a massive collection of Christian biographies published from 1643 onward, mentions the rite of the first night in the stories of St. Margaret and St. Fanon. In both accounts, the practice is presented as a real and active threat that these saints either fought against or helped abolish. The church took this concept seriously enough to build entire stories of heroism around defeating it. And across cultures outside of Europe, similar patterns showed up with even less ambiguity. In certain Indian and South American tribal societies, the taking of a bride's virginity by a chief or priest before the husband was not just common. It was treated as a duty, sometimes religious, sometimes superstitious, sometimes raw dominance. But the result never changed. The most powerful man took what he wanted, and everyone else accepted it. The anthropologist Jörg Vetlau reviewed these patterns across civilizations and across thousands of years of recorded history, and his conclusion was chilling. The rite of the first night, while rarely formalized into written law, functioned as what he called a male power display. It was never about attraction or desire. It was about proving in the most intimate way possible that you owned another human being completely. Their body, their marriage, their future children, all of it belonged to the man at the top. The Myth That Told the Truth, 1902, 2130. So why did this story survive for 4,000 years if it was never a real law? Because the myth captured a truth that dry legal records never could. The jus preeminentis, whether it happened exactly the way the legends describe or not, perfectly expressed what feudalism actually felt like for the people trapped inside it. It was the ultimate expression of powerlessness. The idea that your lord could take even your wedding night, the one moment that was supposed to belong to you and the person you loved, and you had absolutely zero power to stop it. Voltaire understood this. That is why he weaponized the story against the aristocracy. Biomar understood it. That is why he built an entire play around it. Mozart understood it. That is why the opera still fills concert halls 240 years later, and Mel Gibson understood it, too. When Braveheart hit theaters in 1995, that single scene burned itself into the memories of millions. Audiences were horrified. They were furious, and most of them walked out believing every word. The scene worked not because it was accurate, but because it captured something emotionally true. The feeling that a conquering power could strip you of your most intimate moments and leave you with nothing. That resonated because it echoed the real patterns of domination that defined everyday life for millions of medieval serfs. The myth endured because the world that created it was real. Millions of people lived under a system where their bodies, their labor, and their most personal choices belonged to someone else. Whether a lord actually climbed into a bride's bed or simply collected a payment in exchange for not doing so, the message was identical. You are mine. Everything you have is mine, and your happiness exists only because I allow it to. The merchant was real. The lord's total authority over marriage was real. The suffocating control over every aspect of a serf's life was real. The formal legal rite of the first night was probably fiction, but the world that fiction came from, that was as real as it gets. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of this entire story. The myth did not need to be true to be believed, because the reality was already horrifying enough that people heard the legend and thought, yeah, that sounds about right. If you found this as disturbing as I did, you are going to want to see what medieval lords did to punish serfs who tried to fight back. Spoiler, it involved tools that would make a horror movie director quit the industry. That video is on screen right now, and if you made it to the end, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The next episode drops soon, and trust me, it only gets darker from